episode 18 of the podcast, and welcome to the podcast, and welcome to Cardiff, to Dr. Rob Watson. Hello.
Hello.
You've just interrogated, no, that's unfair. You've just recorded something for your podcast, which I'll invite you to talk a little bit more about in a moment. Decentered Media. It talked about sort of community development. It talked about experience and the motivations behind doing podcasts. It went off down all sorts of other avenues as well. But you're a sort of like an expert, a specialist in community media, which I perhaps didn't realise I was doing so much of with these podcasts until I started listening a bit more to your outputs, not just the recorded sort of podcast, but some of the other work that you've done in terms of writing and blogging, etc. I can try and deconstruct those terms. That's something I like to do with this podcast quite a bit, because we can jargonise stuff all too often. Certainly in community development we can. I'm going to see maybe if there's a sweet spot between your background and expertise. What I'd like to think is my background. I'll leave it to others to decide if it's an expertise or not, and see if there's a sweet spot, as I say. So what is it that you do, and specifically the podcast, what were your motivations behind doing that then?
What do I do? I suppose I'm independent at the moment. Used to work at a university in Leicester, doing media production, community media, radio production, that kind of thing. For 20 odd years. Finished a PhD last year in community media, which I'd drawn on some case studies, participant observation within community media groups in Leicester, and it was really kind of looking at the idea of how do you describe this? I suppose I'm dissatisfied with the what we might call mainstream media. I suppose I'm not really a joiner in a organised fun or anything that's kind of organised. I'm not really interested. You can go into a Wetherspoons on a Saturday night and everybody else is having fun and I'm on the outskirts observing. From the point of view of thinking about our media, is I'm more interested in kind of how it works and what motivates people to do things. But I think the deficit that we have in the UK is that we have media which is very narrow and very undemocratic and very monocultural and very embedded and elitist. I don't want to go down a kind of use of the jargon of neoliberalism, all that kind of stuff, but it is self-determined, it's self-reinforcing, it's kind of embedded in routines of so-called professionalism, and I don't think it's serving our communities and our society in a particularly positive way. And it's not driven by it's commercialism. Just rampant commercialism wins out at the moment 9 times out of 10. Cultural considerations are nodded to. The kind of package of the big thing at the moment is the political debates nationally are kind of reflected in our broadcast media. I haven't had a television for years, but I watch things online, and recently I've kind of been watching the news. I pay for a licence fee so I can watch the BBC News, and the kind of punditry and the kind of news reporting is just woeful. It doesn't explain anything, you don't really learn anything, you're not really engaged with it, you don't really find out much. I watch Parliament debate and I find out, and I feel better informed. Because there's a kind of a camaraderie there that's expressed between people who have different views, and it's managed in it is what it is kind of thing, but it doesn't get reflected in our mainstream broadcast media. So less, and I suppose with the rise of things like social media, I'm more inclined to look at not very many alternative platforms, but what it boils down to is, if I've got this dissatisfaction about the way that media works, well, what do I do about it? Well, you make your own, and you get off your backside and you put something together and you have a go. So in 2008, 2009, I kind of persuaded the university I was at to turn a student radio station into a community radio station, and we won a licence for that. But it's very, very difficult to embed a culture of community engagement. So what was the predominant kind of approach was media literacy is based around the imperative for young people who are paying a lot of money for their degrees, and some might argue that this would be a natural thing to do, to get a job in the industry, as the industry is. And really what I kind of wanted to do was to, in some way, facilitate and bring about the new industry that would replace what we've got at the moment, because I don't think it's running to the end of its life. And it's a legacy form of media. Television and radio are legacy forms of media which won't go away, but there's new forms of media. So I got into doing things like blogging and podcasting and using wikis and those kind of things, which kind of trying to, and using social media in a way which is perhaps introducing an element of kind of creativity and independence. It's kind of about that kind of idea of kind of individual empowerment, and not just imitation, not just doing what has already been done, what has already been established, but kind of trying to create the ground, I suppose. Whether I've ever done this, this is the idea that you asked the question. This is the idea that's in the head, but you kind of create the ground, if you like, in which new ideas and new approaches can be fostered and developed. Whereas at the moment there's a kind of reflex to pigeonhole radio, video, writing, newspapers, whatever you want to call it, as as these are these things when they could be many other things.
And I think something that I've come to appreciate by listening to your Decented Media podcast, to some of the sort of things that you've written about. You talk about creating the ground or carving out the ground. I forget the exact words you used, but there's quite a strong ethos of inclusivity within what you claim it needs to be, or how it needs to be. And I guess some of the stuff you're talking about in terms of people coming on into the industry, there's clearly probably a class dimension to those people who can afford university within the market way in which AG's been marketised, the loans, etc. Then on into that accepting in industry. It's closed off, and I've regaled an anecdote on the podcast that we've recorded for you, which I'll obviously signpost. I won't go into depth now. It was about a Welsh Somali girl, Cardiff born and bred, who was telling me about how she wants to start a podcast, isn't quite sure how to start or where to start, because she doesn't see news that affects her life portrayed on the very channels that you've been referring to. There's that inclusivity where perhaps it's frustration about the mainstream media that it's a bit exclusive, whether that's based on class or race or ethnicity or gender or whatever it might be. So that the C word in community media, to my mind, feels a bit more of a genuine use of that term, and it gets at the fact that actually there's lots of different interests potentially at play, potentially wanting to articulate what's going on, whether that's news or culture or whatever it might be.
There's so many levels to this that it's kind of like, it's very difficult to articulate this, but I suppose a few examples. I think you're absolutely right. I remember being at a seminar last year, and again, there was a young woman from Saudi Arabia, and it was the day that the news was announced that women could drive in Saudi Arabia, finally. And she thought this was something that should be talked about and discussed. So she went to BBC Leicester, Radio Leicester, and asked the receptionist, "Is it possible to talk to somebody about this?" To which she got the dead eye comes out, the expertly trained receptionist, which is their jobs, to deflect. No, they're all busy. Come back another time. Where does power sit within our society and our media organisations? You look at commercial radio stations and they're all behind, they're either in an industrial estate in the middle of nowhere behind 6 layers of keypads and swabs to get in, or BBC local stations are very well protected, maybe for good reason, but they're very well protected. But ordinary people can't just walk in and get on the air and exchange their views. So they're left with social media and Facebook, which is a kind of, it's like given your childminder is British American tobacco. Facebook is the equivalent of giving your children and your grandparents cigarettes, because of the kind of addictive, exploitative nature of the way that they design algorithms that promote indignation on social media. So there's kind of got to be a ground somewhere in between these things, which isn't controlled by the state, isn't something which comes down from diktat by the senior managers, the Politburo, like the BBC's run, isn't something which is a kind of pretense of engagement, which is really just to sell advertising. And kind of we've seen that with the consolidation recently of local radio stations who can now, in many places, pretend that they're broadcasting from a city and they're nowhere near that city. And then the other side is the kind of social media side, where it's kind of really about an agenda of clickbaiting and echo chambers. So the centre ground, if you like, is a deliberative model of media, which is where people come together and look each other in the eye and sit around a table, or at least pass each other in a meeting where they're raising money to support the life of the station, or talking about what the kind of content should be. So there's that kind of sense of engagement, and that I think fosters deeper roots, a deeper sense of belonging, it's all that kind of Robert Putnam stuff of you're not doing things in isolation. I can sit at home on Twitter, and I often do, and I can just fire things out because I'm upset about something or indignant about something, but that doesn't mean to say that I'm accountable to anybody else. And the definition of community is, for me, is that sense that you're not, you are an individual, but you are only enabled as an individual to do what you do because of the nature of the community that surrounds you, the nature of the society that surrounds you. And they're two sides of the same coin. The problem we've got, we kind of have a polarising debate about this, which pushes people to the one extreme or the other. So either socially, if you go to America, socialism is bad and individualism is great, or vice versa. And kind of having that kind of lack of communitarian, centre ground, values-driven approaches.
It's interesting to use the word power, because I would argue that community development is very much, or should very much concern itself with how that power is not only distributed and configured, but also then utilised and expressed. And there are deep-seated inequalities that we've got in communities. But within that sort of ecosystem, if I may apply a word to how you've kind of defined it for you, it's important that information is exchanged, that people have the opportunity to digest that information, utilise it in certain ways, and media is presumably quite sort of central to that. And I've always said, and you hear any number of community development workers working maybe on a stage or in a village or whatever, talk about how important word of mouth is. What's prompted that word of mouth? What's initially set that ripple up? And it's often aspects of news and media. But what else what else can it comprise, that M word then? So you've done the C word in community media, but the M word in media in that traditional sort of community development environment.
I have a kind of theoretical problem with the study of power. It's often fetishised by itself. We must look at power. Everything's about power, and it's incredibly important. But you've also got to look at, so you might have different levels of power: overt power, coercive power, controlling power, legal power. There's a counter power, and I think it's Foucault says, kind of where there's power, there's resistance. What does that consist of? That tacit information. And I kind of look, the kind of work of, I can't pronounce his name because apparently I'm not Portuguese or Spanish. Is he Paulo Freire?
Portuguese.
Yeah. So I've been told by some Brazilian, but because I don't speak Portuguese, I can't pronounce it. So but that idea of kind of empowering people is to, what power is to tell you that you don't have a voice, or you don't have an opinion, or that you don't have options. And actually, once you are aware that you might have just one option, or you might just have one opportunity to express an opinion or to use your voice for something, then the spell of power is broken, if you like. So those who have that power over us, and I think we live in a kind of media world, and my frustration is that almost that kind of, it's like the emperor's new clothes. Why aren't people more actively and overtly pointing this out? Is that there is the power of broadcast journalism, the power of the state-sponsored journalists, the power of the corporate media, marketing-led media producers. It kind of isn't really a power if we just get on and do something else by ourselves. And the technology has shifted. The disruption of social media technologies and being able to do things like podcasts like this means that a wider range of voices can be heard, for good or ill, and it works both ways. So we see the rise of the alt-right, and we see the rise of the kind of communitarian left, and both are part of the same deal in terms of you allow. I was drawn to the kind of, there's again paraphrasing C.G. Jung saying, if you deny people, I've said this many times, one of the few quotes I actually remember is, if you deny people the opportunity to tell their stories, evil will prosper. And I think we live in a world where we're denied the opportunity to tell our own individual stories, or our neighbourhood stories, or our community stories of identity, or a sense of belonging, or a sense of in the world that we work in, the world that we live in, the world that we engage with other people in. And so it's a state of powerlessness in the broader sense that we're kind of not being listened to, and that the whole form of media regulation and industry and commerce isn't actually focused with the interests of people in mind. It's just it's quite exploitative. So I think my analogy of British American tobacco, just wanting to give your kids cigarettes and inculcate them into the culture of smoking, is a good parallel, because I think a lot of our media is exploitative. And it's interesting, our media regulator, Ofcom, its media literacy's remit is very much about which websites and which shopping websites you buy your trainers from. How do you know a fake site from a real site? How do you choose a mobile phone contract? It's not about civic empowerment. It's not about respecting people as creative agents and individuals of their own identity and their own sense of belonging in their own communities. It's something which we're seen as consumers, and we're seen as kind of passive consumers. So it's the market will provide. But what we end up with in that kind of market will provide model is, the analogy I always use is, in 2008, the Thornton's chocolate chain was, there was 1,000 branches of Thornton's chocolates. And they nearly went bust, and they had to flood the market with cheap. I remember seeing them stacked up outside motorway service stations because they needed the cash. And you think, why do we have 1,000 Thornton's chocolate branches, or 1,000 coffee shops? Cafe Nero or Costa Coffee. Why do we need a kind of a system of these things? Why can't communities organise these things? So if we'd have had 1,000 independent, family-run, local cooperative-run chocolatiers, then maybe in the recession, 300 would have gone under, but 600 would have survived, and it could have regrown. We saw in that recession that store after store after store went, with all of their branches closing down because of centralisation. Yeah. So kind of decentralisation of our media needs to be, and localism for our media is kind of fairly important.
Mm-hmm. I've been struck by, since becoming conscious of your work and your output and your podcast, with something that Alan Twelvetrees, who people, regular listeners to this, will appreciate the sort of the esteem I hold Alan in. It was more than just a coincidence that he was the first person I had on the Community Development podcast on episode 1. And one of the things that he said, both in that podcast but a little bit more off there really, and some of the stuff he's written about as well, is he was lacking in the most recent version of his community workbook, which is quite a seminal text, a lot about media, use of the internet, digital kind of technologies within community development, practice, community work. And that what he has got in the most recent edition is largely from North America and from Canada, where it appears that some of that has been driven, that technological advancement has been driven by the sheer size of that country and the distances that you've got covered. So stuff that is broadcast across the internet clearly brings people closer together, is the phrase we use, on a very practical basis as a means to an end in Canada. And I think there is a glaring gap, huge gap within community development practice and learning in the UK about the role and the potential role and the use of different technologies of this nature, and community media would fall into that, and it's quite a broad church. And I go back to the 4th edition of his book, and there's a really, there's such a limited, this is not a criticism of Alan by any means, I think it just reflects where we are, a tiny section related to media, and 95% of that is about press releases, trying to get stuff in the newspaper, trying to get a reporter to your community event, all of which, and I've been there, it's really hard to bring about, but we keep doing it. And it's almost like we're on a hamster wheel, we keep trying those things. So what you say about us doing this stuff, and it is in part motivated by availability and affordability of the equipment and so on. But I suppose even if the equipment is there and it's affordable, there still has to be some wherewithal. There still has to be some sort of germ of motivation to want to get involved in this thing and in this sort of work. And I'm not aware that there's still a huge driver in the part of community development sort of sector workforce to do this. And I use the old adage that, you know, where there's been podcasts dedicated to community development practice, they tend to have followed the money, as so much of what we do does. They're funded to exist. And as soon as the funding for programs and initiatives is pulled, then the media sort of withers away. And there might be other examples that you can think of as well. But I'm kind of struck that there's this huge gap for us to plug. And I think what's interesting is then that not so much that we use the media just to tell people about what we do or why we do, and we reduce the invisibility, which is something that Alan talks about, our practice. It's invisible and we need to develop the skills to make our processes more visible. But it might actually be something that motivates people to get involved, motivate people to question, motivate people to challenge some of the orthodoxies that exist within their communities, within society. And they might actually have something that has that helps organise as well. And I'm struck by a guy, Terence, who's been doing this stuff since I was in short trousers in Riverside District in Cardiff. And he talks about community radio in the 1970s, and it's very much part and parcel of his recollection and the experience at the time around things to do with movements around rent control, about tenancies, about housing, very much geared towards things like feminist movement and ethnic diversity, anti-racism. And that radio was absolutely critical to some of that sort of stuff. It was how you communicated what was going on. And it seems to maybe we've I don't know, maybe we lost a little bit of a trick in the power of these things.
Well, I think it's, first of all, community development has been out of fashion since the 1970s. It's been pushed out of government. Government departments don't know. It's not embedded as a qualification or a practice within policy making. It's not, or hasn't been, or has been lost part of the process of engaging with how we use the resources of civic society and public authorities and local government in order to be able to maximise a kind of sense of engagement or a sense of development. That was kind of taken out, that was pushed out of the community development networks, and community development practice were pushed out of fashion and favour in the 1980s. And so it became a more market driven, it became quite technocratic and process and systems driven. And so there's a kind of return back to interest in community development now, because people are realising that you can't just command and control redevelopment. You can't just come in and build a highway. There's a question of, I was talking to a guy last year who works for the Liverpool City Region office, and the money that came in through Europe in terms of building roads and infrastructure. You see this around Europe in terms of airports that get built and highways that get built and then they don't get used because the money seems to, the fashionable thing to do is to build the infrastructure and not to develop the communities. And I have an analogy which is the town and the tram. And I was on holiday in Montpellier a few years ago, and they've got a fantastic tram system there if you ever get to go. I like cities with trams, and they've introduced this tram system. It's taken a lot of the cars out of the city centre. So it's much more pleasant to walk around, but the tram is as regular as clockwork. You start at 5 o'clock in the morning, finishes at midnight, something like that, and you guarantee you're going to get where you are. But when you sit on the tram, nobody looks at each other, nobody talks to each other. You've got your headphones on, you're reading your book, you're staring out of the window. It's not a social space, but where people are going to is the town centre often, and that's where the social space exists. That's where the bars and the cafes and the shops and the museums and the culture is. And too often what we do is we focus on the tram and not on the town, and we focus on the system of delivery and not what it is that people are going to get out of that and how that changes and evolves. So we become very kind of oriented towards the process and not the values that are driven by that. So we've got a kind of media model which is fundamentally based around, you mentioned about local stories and issues of local concern to people and topics that that might agitate people, rightly concern them. But try getting that onto a local radio station without it being packaged up as a kind of, to get it onto a BBC station, you would have to have an antagonist and a protagonist and an independent referee that they could turn to. But you couldn't just talk about it. You couldn't just get to people together to say, what are you concerned about? Well, I'm concerned about parking, or I'm concerned about development of these apartment blocks that are shooting up everywhere with no real engagement with communities, that decimate existing communities, that kind of challenge the nature of what we mean by acceptable forms of housing, amenities in an area, the kind of support. And there's no civic conversation about these things going on. Where do these discussions take place? Not in our media, because they're packaged up and pre-packaged up for us as little kind of, you quick hits with a press release. So you have to learn, and it's a kind of mass media model of the 20th century, of a kind of transactionalism. So you kind of look at it as that what you're doing is you're packaging a message, or encoding a message, and then somebody decodes it at the other end, and it's seen in those very narrow terms like marketing and advertising, when actually it can be so much more. It can be creative, it can be deliberative, debate, conversational, it can be pointless and meaningless. It doesn't have to be the kind of formulaic patterns. I was struck the other year that there's a DAB station launched in Glasgow, which was the News UK, promoting a lot of radio stations these days. They're getting big into the radio market. And it was an 80s hit station. What on earth is the point of that? The people of Glasgow, I'm sure they really don't need to know, what was number one in 1983 in February again. And if they do, they can probably look it up online, or it might be fairly nice to drive along to. But as the technology changes, you've probably got that on your phone anyway. We have very limited cultural choices and a very limited cultural repertoire. So we've kind of gone backwards in many ways, I think. And it's kind of like if your choices in life, I'll shut up in a second, your choices in life are between Primark and John Lewis. I think we live in a very narrow, shallow society, which is reflected in the high levels of anxiety, the high levels of violence and dysfunction. A report was out yesterday about the amount of drugs that people take in the UK, way higher than mainstream Europe, because we don't have the kind of society where people are allowed to be social and to have social opportunities without the pressures of consumption, or the pressures of projecting yourself as a kind of, the kind of Instagram influencers type nonsense.
This is exactly the point that Becky made on episode 15, I think it was, with Benthig, the Library of Things, where she had a premature baby, she was struggling financially by her own admission, and the library was the place that she was getting the stuff that you talked about, a sense of nourishment, a sense of belonging, help, very practical help, somebody showing an interest, somebody caring. Family weren't particularly local, partner had to go back to work, etc., etc. And the library was that place where she could get that. And there's a very, very crucial thing that she says in that podcast, I would encourage anyone to listen to it because Becky's brilliant on it, is that there was no expectation that she had to pay anything to access that. And increasingly we talk about the loss of public spaces, be it sort of park environments, or be it just the welfare halls and the stutes, etc. But actually there's some that are still there, but there's fees levied to use them, and she doesn't emphasise it as much as perhaps it almost deserved to be, and it's not a criticism because it's something we just take for granted. Actually, I don't think we're going to take libraries for granted in another sort of 10 years, because I fear that there'll be an artefact, there'll be a relic, social cultural relic of those things. Do you remember we used to be able to go and get books and things? I'm struck by the cultural trust in Bridgend County Borough called Awen, which has taken over the running of Bridgend's libraries, and there's a whole debate around whether that's the right thing. It's that asset transfer to charitable trusts, etc. And some people are for it, some people are against it. But I think very progressively they've done away with fines. Just don't bother with fines. Let's just get away. It just creates a barrier, and I think again it's something that just runs counter to this notion of, well, if it's going to exist, it has to have a fee levied against it. It has to have and begin to behave in some sort of marketised way, or a way that conforms to market logic. And I think it's just those little things that just go, actually, why does it need to be that way?
And it's the notion of what is for the social good.
Yeah.
Now there is a problem about who decides and who gets to
Absolutely.
make the choice of what is good, socially good, and what isn't. But if we're more open and deliberative about that, and you decide that at lower levels of civic engagement, if you like, and through more participative forms of community media where people can start to talk about these things in a facilitated way and an accountable way, then what defines what the social good is comes through the deliberative process, not being imposed on people because of an ideology, whether it's a statist ideology and a systems ideology. You know, we provide X number of books and libraries, therefore the people will be educated. Well, if that doesn't work like that. You've got to draw people, or the market ideology, which is, you know, which again kind of fails. The library one's really interesting because if I had this conversation with a librarian at a meeting I was at recently, and I kind of made the point that one of the things that we've lost with libraries is that they're a quiet place to sit and read.
Yeah.
And it's shocking. I was up in Liverpool at the weekend and I went to the Picton Library, which is this amazing round, like the British Library if you picture it. It's this amazing space. Every turn of the page you can hear from 30 foot away.
Where's that again, sorry?
In Liverpool. If you ever get a chance to visit, it's they've made the library, they've really invested in this library space, and it's got all of the computers and the bays and the things on the one side, but the traditional library space of silence is still there.
The National Library in Aberystwyth was, anyway, I haven't been there for a while, when I was a student in Aberystwyth, again, very similar, just incredibly ornate, it's very delicate. Everything about it felt delicate and precious, which, you know, may not be what people are looking for. But
what I'm seeing now, though, is coffee shops in Leicester, where I'm based, is that there are lots of students sitting in there doing their work. And they'll have one coffee which lasts them 3 hours or whatever it is, and the staff are kind of trying to get some more paying customers in.
Yeah.
But it's that kind of privatisation of a space which should be provided. Isn't that a social space? A non-market social space where people can come and do work. And if we're expecting people, co-working spaces, if we're expecting people to engage in the knowledge economy, then it means that you have to put the provision in for seclusion from the pressures of, because you can't focus and concentrate in the same way. It takes me a lot to shake off the kind of the noise of the day and the bombardment of media of the day, so you can sit down and write and think and absorb, and, you know, kind of, even if it's just sketching notes or something like that, that's quite a difficult practice. But we live in a society, and I think it's exemplified by a lot of our models of radio, which are about projecting at you and bombarding you with messages. It's kind of driven by a kind of top-down, we know better, we're the professionals, you don't know what you're talking about kind of thing.
But also, and I'm coming, this is less an expert on it, but also it almost feels like it's about generating a response. We need to chuck a few stones in the pond just to create some ripples, and then we can, this will carry on.
The phone lines will light up.
The phone lines will light up. Whereas that more deliberative process, it is inherently, it takes longer, it is slower. But actually, I think when you talk about aspects of participative media, participative democracy, I think, again, is the same. Intuitively, to my mind, I think we just come to better conclusions and better decisions for having gone through those more deliberative processes and stages. And within that, and again, it's not linear, it's not we just start here and we end up over at that point. It's almost, it takes a couple of steps back. Yeah. It's inherently reflective as well, which is something we talk a lot about.
The interesting things when we think about kind of civic journalism and the discussions about how we can promote different types of voices in journalism and news reporting, and what actually facilitates that. Now, my experience is, for a large number of community radio stations, it's just almost impossible to do news in its traditional format that the broadcasters regard, regular bulletins, that kind of thing. They might be talking about things topically, but they don't have a news cycle and a news process and all the things that kind of verify that. So they tend to steer away from doing that. But it raises the kind of questions about it's news is there are gatekeepers for news for professional reasons, and journalists. I don't like the word I don't like calling people journalists. When did we start calling people journalists? They were reporters 20 years ago, not journalists. Journalists for me are kind of those reporters who, all the President's Men stuff, they're digging around, in the depths of the story, the hidden parts of the story, whereas reporters tell you what's going on. And we've kind of got this model of, well, what's wrong with just settling for people telling you what's going on? But because we don't have, as you say, a kind of open process of this, then most people feel excluded that what counts as news is what their daily lives and what their experiences are doesn't count as newsworthy. But they'll express their indignation on Facebook in their network groups, and they'll talk about things which matter to them because, whether it's immigration, positive or negative, whether it's public services, positive or negative experiences, people will talk about these things. But journalists now are, because of the kind of, and the Cairncross Review reflected this to some extent, was the pressures of the economics of public journalism are such that it's very restrictive and very difficult to employ people to do independent journalism, beat reporting, those kind of things. So what you end up doing is regurgitating press releases. There's a new hamburger chain. Yeah. What's the newspaper in Cardiff? Is it?
You've got the South Wales Echo, which would be the Evening Daily, and then you've also got Western Mail, then, which is a bit more sort of Wales focused.
And you've probably seen a creeping rise of features about kind of chain restaurants and things, and it becomes the news element of it becomes ever narrower and narrower, and the resources are taken away. And the government put public subsidy into the local democracy reporters scheme, the local news partnership, which is administered by the BBC. But in my mind, that money has gone to supporting a failing commercial model, and not priming and underpinning an emerging civic community model. And the point I'm trying to get to is that it rests around this idea of what we call news. News is a very packaged, artificial concept, that what you define as news, by the professionals define news as a very specific, narrow thing. But between you and I, the fact that my bus might be late is news for me. Yeah. And if it's consistently late, and if it's consistently late for everybody else that I share my indignation on Twitter with, is that a news item? Mm-hmm. You're in a kind of change situation, and we need to redefine things. We've run out of meaningful definitions for some of these things, and we need to look at new ways to define them.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. We've already been speaking for a while with your podcast as well, and there's an interesting Venn diagram between what was covered there and what was covered here. If people want to keep in touch with you, Rob, what's the best ways?
On Twitter, Rob W Media or Decentered Media, and it's spelt the American way, so it's got the extra E in it.
Okay.
Right. So kind of quite dyslexic, so I took out the URL and then realised, because you check on Google and it comes up Decentered with the ER, not to the RE. So
you've got to go with what you got. I wanted at the CD podcast, that would have been perfect, but it was already taken.
I did get the other one though as well. So
yeah, it's about a life. It's something to do with like life management as well. And I still couldn't quite work out. And I think, as I joked on your podcast, I don't quite have the resource to buy them out of that particular Twitter handle just yet. But and I'd encourage people to get involved with what you do, because I think there is a lot to learn from what we do, which, should never lose sight of the fact it's about people, and it's about engaging with those people, as far and away as possible on face-to-face terms, and to speak to people, white to their eyes, and all that kind of stuff. But I think there's something very empowering about, I talk about this a little bit more about on your podcast that we did earlier, but there's something I think quite empowering about giving people the opportunity to articulate their own voice, in their own accent, and they don't have to be the polished orator. They don't have to be, the most educated person or the most, verbose person, whatever it might be.
Well, the other thing I say about the financial crash in 2008, it wasn't because there was a shortage of clever people. Actually, there were lots of very many clever people who thought they were all very clever, and a couple of people like me sitting around the table saying, "I don't understand. Can you explain it in ordinary language?" might have helped.
No, absolutely. But I think there's something about the authenticity that people in their own voice, as I say, is the point I'm trying to make. It's quite empowering, and I think it's also it's in a very traditional way, but I think it's in an effective way of holding truth to power as well. Whether that is local community leaders, whether it's your local elected member, MPs, elected politicians, people in the police or whatever.
But the bottom line as well is kind of sitting around with a group of people that you are prepared to spend time with. Think of it like you're just sitting around having a cup of tea, like we're having a cup of tea now. If you want to do community media, sit around a table and have a conversation over a cup of tea. That is your starting point. If you can put a microphone in there and record it, then that's the next step.
Absolutely. I like dolly mixtures as well, but they're not essential. I think you're right, and I think what might be an interesting reflection of Alan's book and how little there is in that around the use of media and the role of media would be perhaps a reflection of how us as a sector have tended to be detached, maybe through our own efforts, through our own reticence, from media sources, mainstream or otherwise. And so, maybe there's something we need to do to sort of come together, but I don't think it's all of it. Like anything, I'm overly simplifying here. It's not about camps. That makes it sound much more oppositional than I intended to, but it's about maybe the media coming to understand a little bit about what we do, reducing that invisibility, giving us the opportunity.
Not a little bit, I think entirely. I think this is the challenge. I think I would never teach media production again. I would teach community development and add media to that.
Yeah. Let's leave it there. Perfect. Thank you.